was 34 years old when I returned to Birch Creek, a small town in northern Minnesota where I had lived until I was 17. These days I live in Minneapolis and work as a freelance photographer, mostly doing real estate, small weddings, and family shoots. Nothing very glamorous. I hadn't been back to Birch Creek in almost 8 years, not because I had some huge trauma there, but because after my mother moved to Wisconsin and my grandmother stayed alone in that old house, I just kept putting the trip off. My grandmother, Elaine, died in early October after falling at home and having some complications at the hospital. She was 89 years old. The house was left to me and my mother, but my mother didn't even want to think about dealing with it, so I agreed to go there, separate what was worth keeping, throw out the rest, and talk to a local realtor about putting the house up for sale. I arrived on a Friday afternoon with my trunk full of empty boxes, tape, gloves, trash bags, and my camera, because I was also going to take some good photos of the house before listing it. The place looked smaller than I remembered. It was a simple white 2-story house with peeling paint near the porch and an old damp wood smell the moment I opened the door. It was cold, that dry October cold in Minnesota, and the sky was already turning gray before 5 in the afternoon. The street was too quiet. Some houses still belonged to the same families from when I was a kid, but almost nobody appeared at the windows or on the porches when I parked. I only saw an older woman crossing the street with a small dog pretending she didn't recognize me. I didn't think much of it. Small towns were always like that, polite on the outside and strange underneath. That first night I decided to start with the basement, because it was the most cluttered part of the house and also the one that bothered me the most. The stairs creaked in a way I remembered clearly, and the air down there was colder than the rest of the house, smelling like old paper, dust, wet dirt, and a little mildew. There was a single bare light bulb hanging from the ceiling, with one of those pull strings casting everything in a yellow glow and filling the corners with shadows. I spent almost an hour sorting through dried paint cans, rusty toolboxes, Christmas decorations, and old clothes stored in plastic bags. Nothing strange at first, just the kind of things an old person never throws away. Then behind a low shelf near the heater, I found a cardboard box sealed with brown tape so old the tape had become brittle. On the side, my grandmother had written "old photos" in black marker. I sat down right there on the floor because my back was already hurting and opened the box expecting to find family pictures, birthdays, maybe something from my childhood. There was some of that too, but at the bottom there was a large manila envelope with no name on it. Inside, I found dozens of Polaroids. Most were faded with those yellowish edges old Polaroids get, but I could clearly see groups of people gathered near a lake. It wasn't a large lake, at least it didn't seem like one. There were pine trees around it, a narrow shoreline, dark mud, and an old dock in the background. The strange part was that as I flipped through the photos, I started recognizing faces. One of them was the town's old pharmacist. Another was my elementary school music teacher. Then I saw a woman named Diane Miller, who everyone said had suddenly moved away to North Dakota when I was a kid and never came back. But there she was, standing near the water looking at the camera with an expression that didn't look like someone casually out on a normal trip. I kept looking through the Polaroids longer than I should have. I think I sat on that cold basement floor for about 40 minutes without noticing time passing. The silence in the house didn't help either. The old heater made metallic popping sounds every now and then, and I could hear the wind hitting the branches outside near the small basement windows. Some of the pictures showed large gatherings like cookouts or community events, people holding beers, children running in the background, men fishing near the shore. But there was something wrong with them that I started noticing little by little. In almost every photo, the people looked uncomfortable facing the camera. It wasn't that natural smile you see in old pictures. Many looked serious or were staring off to the side. In some photos, it almost looked like they had been photographed without realizing it. I also noticed that some people appeared repeatedly in different years written on the white border of the Polaroids in blue ink. 1982, 1984, 1987. And some of those people I knew for certain had supposedly moved away from town. Birch Creek had always been like that. Someone disappeared and the adults just said they had moved somewhere else. When I was a child, that sounded normal. Small town, little opportunity, people leaving. But looking at those photos alone in the basement, it suddenly felt strange for the first time. There was one photo in particular that genuinely unsettled me. It showed 5 people standing in a line near the water at sunset. The quality was poor, but one of them looked like my grandfather, who died before I was born. Behind the group, partially hidden among the trees, there was someone watching. I couldn't make out a face or clothes clearly, just a dark silhouette standing between the pine trees. The worst part was realizing that in 2 other photos the same figure seemed to be there again in the background. The next morning I woke up early because the house was freezing. The thermostat barely worked and I slept badly all night listening to the wood creaking. Outside, everything felt damp, that typical climate you get near lakes in Minnesota even when it isn't raining. I made coffee in my grandmother's old coffee maker and decided to go into town to buy a few things before continuing to clean the house. Birch Creek is small enough to basically have one main street: a hardware store, a diner, a gas station, and a grocery store. While I was having coffee at the diner, I casually started asking about the lake in the photos. I didn't ask in a weird way. I just showed one of the Polaroids to the waitress, a woman named Linda who had worked there since I was a teenager, and asked if she recognized the place. The second she saw the photo, her expression completely changed. It wasn't fear exactly, more like irritation mixed with nervousness. She handed the photo back too quickly and said something like, "Probably one of the northern lakes," before immediately changing the subject. She started asking about Minneapolis, about my mother, anything to avoid talking about it. Later, I went to the grocery store and basically the same thing happened with a guy named Roger who had gone to school with me years earlier. When I mentioned the lake, he stared at the photo for a couple seconds and then said, "You shouldn't be digging through your grandmother's old things." That unsettled me in a way that's hard to explain. It didn't feel like a joke or small-town superstition. It felt more like I had touched on something everyone had agreed to forget a long time ago, and that was when I started noticing something else. Several people in town were watching me more than normal ever since I arrived. I went back to the house around noon trying to convince myself I was overreacting. Small towns love gossip and stupid secrets. That's what I kept repeating in my head while cleaning the kitchen and sorting through some of my grandmother's belongings. But I couldn't stop thinking about the photos. Eventually, I grabbed the envelope again and brought everything to the living room table near the front window where there was better light. I spent almost 2 hours studying every Polaroid carefully. Some had names written on the back, others had dates. One of them said Blackwater Lake, summer of 1985. Finally, a name. I had never heard of that lake before, which felt strange because I grew up fishing and riding my bike all around that area. Birch Creek only had a few large lakes and everybody knew their names. Blackwater Lake meant nothing to me. I pulled out my phone and tried searching Google, but the signal out there was terrible and almost nothing loaded properly inside the house. What I eventually found was an old map showing a small lake north of town, near a heavily forested area with barely any paved roads. I stared at it for a few minutes without really knowing why, but I started feeling that uncomfortable curiosity that keeps growing even when you know you should let something go. Then I found something else inside the envelope. A folded newspaper clipping at the bottom. It was from 1989. The headline talked about dredging operations carried out by the local police in a lake in the area for environmental reasons. The article was tiny and half the ink had faded, but I could still make out a sentence mentioning unidentified human remains. It explained nothing else. Not how many bodies. Not who they were. Not what happened afterward. And someone had circled that sentence in red pen years ago. Later that day, I started driving around town trying to remember where some of the old roads from my teenage years had been. The sky was getting dark early again, heavy in that way that makes it seem like it's about to snow even when no snow is forecast. I ended up stopping near the river where fishermen used to gather in the evenings. There was only one man there sitting alone on a wooden bench near the water, wrapped in a thick dark green coat and smoking. I recognized him almost immediately. Walter Grady. When I was a kid, he worked as a fishing guide and repaired boat motors. He had to be around 80 now. I walked over mostly out of impulse. We talked for a few minutes about my grandmother, about the town, normal things. Then I showed him one of the photos. The second Walter saw the Polaroid, he slowly took the cigarette out of his mouth and stared at the lake in my hand without saying a word. The wind was strong that evening, and I remember the cold smell of river water mixed with the scent of damp cigarette smoke. Finally, he asked where I found it. When I explained about my grandmother's basement, he became visibly uneasy, glancing around before answering. Then he said quietly, almost muttering, "Nobody's gone into that water for decades." I asked why. He took a long time to answer again. Then he said that back in the 1980s, the police started secretly dredging the lake in the middle of the night. According to him, they found bodies trapped in the mud at the bottom. Some identified, others not. He also said nobody officially talked about it because Birch Creek depended on fishing tourism back then, and the town didn't want a scandal. When I asked who the bodies belonged to, Walter looked at me for a few seconds before saying something that made me cold even with my jacket on. Some of them were people everybody swore had moved away. The moment Walter said that, I felt real physical discomfort, not movie fear or a jump scare. My stomach just dropped. I immediately tried to rationalize it, thinking maybe it was just an old man exaggerating small-town conspiracy theories, something like that. But the way he spoke didn't sound like someone making up stories to scare me. He looked tired, truly tired. I kept asking what exactly had happened at the lake, but Walter clearly started regretting opening his mouth. He kept glancing toward the road behind us while talking. He said the dredging happened over several weeks during the summer of 1989, always late at night, and many people in town pretended not to notice police trucks driving near the forest. According to him, nobody ever received official information. Just rumors. Bodies found chained underwater, sunken cars near the shore, clothes buried in the mud. He also said state police officers came into town around that time and then simply disappeared without giving any public explanation. When I asked why my grandmother would have kept those photos, Walter fell silent. The river water moved slowly against the rocks near the shore, while the wind made dry sounds through the bare trees behind us. Finally, he said something that still bothers me to remember, because a lot of people around here knew more than they admitted. After that, he basically ended the conversation himself. He tossed his cigarette on the ground, stood up slowly, and before climbing into his truck, he told me to sell the house quickly and go back to Minneapolis. The way he said it didn't sound like advice. It sounded like a warning. By the time I got back to the house, it was already getting dark. The whole street looked empty again, but I started noticing small details I would have ignored before. A pickup truck parked across the street with the engine running. Curtains moving in neighboring houses when I pulled into the driveway. That constant feeling of being watched. Maybe it was paranoia by then, but it felt real. I went inside, locked the door, and started searching for more things connected to the lake. I was obsessed at that point. I went through my grandmother's old drawers, cabinets, and boxes in the attic. Eventually, I found a small notebook hidden inside an old sewing tin in her bedroom. It wasn't exactly a diary, more like scattered notes, names, dates, and short sentences. Some pages had been ripped out. One entry said, "They said Diane left town, but I saw her car near the lake that night." Another said, "Engine noises after 2 a.m. again." And the last readable note directly mentioned Blackwater Lake along with the sentence, "Nobody believes they're still doing this." I was sitting on her bed reading that when I heard a sound outside. It wasn't loud, just the sound of tires slowly moving down the wet street. I froze for a few seconds listening. The car slowed down directly in front of the house, then stopped, without turning off the engine. I clearly remembered the digital clock next to the bed reading 8:47 p.m. while I sat there in the dark trying to decide whether I was overreacting or not. Then I heard something worse. 3 slow knocks on the front door. The moment I heard the knocks, I completely froze. It wasn't an exaggerated reaction. It was that automatic paralysis when your brain is trying to decide whether there's real danger or if you're slipping into paranoia. The house was far too quiet, and those 3 knocks echoed through the wood as if someone were standing directly outside the door with no hurry at all. I instinctively turned off the bedroom lamp and listened. The car engine was still running outside. I could hear it faintly through the walls, mixed with the wind moving through the dry trees on the street. I waited a few more seconds and heard another series of knocks, this time slightly louder. I walked downstairs slowly, trying not to make noise, feeling the cold banister under my hand. The floor creaked so much it felt impossible to move without announcing every step. When I reached the living room, I looked through the side window without fully opening the curtain. It was a dark pickup truck parked in front of the house. Old, probably from the 1990s. Headlights off. Just the engine running. Someone was sitting in the driver's seat, but I couldn't see the face clearly because of the darkness and the reflection on the glass. The worst part was realizing nobody was standing on the porch. Even so, a few seconds later I heard another knock on the door. Very close. As if the person were right on the other side of the wood. My heart started racing for real then because it made no sense. I stood there barely breathing, trying to hear any movement. Then the doorknob slowly turned. Not violently, just a slow test, like someone checking whether the door was locked. Then silence again. I didn't open the door, I never even considered it. I grabbed my phone and stood in the kitchen trying to decide whether to call the police. But honestly, something about everything that had happened made involving the local police feel like a terrible idea. It sounds irrational now, I know, but after talking to Walter and reading my grandmother's notes, I simply didn't trust anyone there anymore. I watched through the curtain for several minutes. The pickup truck stayed parked outside. The driver never got out, never honked, never did anything, just sat there. At some point I noticed something else strange. The porch light partially reflected on the wet pavement, and I could see fresh tire marks passing in front of the house multiple times, like the truck had circled the block before stopping there. Finally, after maybe 15 minutes, the truck slowly drove away without any hurry. I stayed frozen watching until the taillights disappeared at the end of the street. I thought it was over. But about half an hour later, I heard noises coming from the backyard. It wasn't an animal. It was clearly someone stepping on dry leaves behind the house. The sound came from near my grandmother's old shed. Slow footsteps, stopping, then continuing. I turned off all the kitchen lights and walked toward the back door, trying to see through the small square window above the sink. The backyard was almost completely dark, only partially lit by the weak moonlight and the distant glow from the side street. And that was when I saw someone standing near the shed staring directly at the house. The person stood still long enough that I started questioning whether someone was really there or if my brain was turning shadows into people. Then the figure moved. Just slightly. A slow sideways step near the shed. I could make out the shape of a tall man wearing something dark, probably a thick jacket. I couldn't see any face. My first instinct was to grab something to defend myself, so I opened the kitchen drawer and found a heavy flashlight and an old meat knife my grandmother used. It sounds ridiculous now, but at the time it made me feel less vulnerable. I kept watching through the window and realized the man wasn't trying to break into the house. That was what made me most nervous. If it had been a robbery, trespassing, or some kind of prank, I could at least understand it a little. But this felt different. The guy simply wanted me to know he was there. After a few minutes, he slowly started walking toward the back of the yard near the fence leading into the wooded area behind the house. His footsteps made dry sounds over the dead leaves. At one point, he disappeared completely into the darkness. I waited to hear the gate or branches snapping, but nothing happened. Just silence. A silence so heavy I started hearing my own breathing loudly inside the kitchen. I barely slept that night. I sat on the living room couch with all the lights off, alternating between staring at the front window and the hallway leading to the back of the house. Sometime around 2 in the morning, I heard a vehicle slowly driving past the house again. Then once more, and again, always slowing down in front of the house. The next morning, I had already decided to leave earlier than planned. I didn't even care about finishing the cleanup anymore. I wanted distance from that place, but before leaving, I made the mistake of trying to find Blackwater Lake. Part of me still needed to know whether all of this was real, or if I had fallen into a paranoid spiral fueled by old stories. I grabbed the Polaroids, the newspaper clipping, and drove along the old roads shown on the map I found on my phone. The farther north of town I went, the emptier the area became. The paved road turned into gravel, then into little more than dirt surrounded by forest on both sides. The sky was completely gray and damp, and there was low fog hanging between the trees. In some places, it felt like driving through a tunnel of pine trees. My GPS lost signal several times. After almost 40 minutes, I found a narrow entrance partially hidden by vegetation and an old sign lying on the ground. The paint was almost gone, but I could still read Blackwater Access Road. The path was extremely narrow, full of mud and deep, fresh tire tracks. That caught my attention immediately because the place looked abandoned for years. Even so, someone clearly still drove there often. I continued slowly until the forest opened near the water, and the moment I saw the lake for the first time, I felt the same immediate discomfort I felt while looking at the photos in the basement. The place looked wrong. The water was extremely dark, almost black, with no reflection even during daylight. There were no birds, no boats, no sounds besides the weak wind moving through the trees and the water softly hitting the muddy shore. Then I noticed something else. There was a pickup truck parked near the old wooden dock. The same dark truck that had stopped in front of my grandmother's house the night before. The moment I recognized the truck, my entire body went cold in a way that's hard to explain. It wasn't just fear. It was that physical sensation of realizing too late that you've walked into somewhere you shouldn't be. The vehicle looked empty, at least apparently, parked crooked near the old dock with mud covering the sides. The engine was off this time. I sat inside my car for maybe a full minute, trying to decide whether to immediately back out or if I was descending into complete paranoia. The forest around the lake was too quiet, not the peaceful silence of nature. A strange, heavy silence without birds, insects, or almost anything else. I picked up one of the Polaroids from the passenger seat and compared it to the place. It was the same lake, same dock, same curve along the shoreline. Even some of the trees looked identical despite decades having passed. Then I noticed something that immediately tightened my chest. There were fresh marks in the mud near the water, a lot of them. Footprints, tire tracks, and something dragged toward the lake. It looked like a trail carved through the dark mud leading down to the shore. I shouldn't have gotten out of the car, but I did anyway. The cold near the water felt more intense than in town. The smell was terrible too. Not exactly the strong smell of a dead animal, but a damp, metallic, rotten odor rising from the mud near the edge of the lake. I walked slowly, looking around until I noticed something caught among the reeds near the shallow water. Fabric. A piece of light-colored fabric partially buried in the mud. When I got closer, I realized it looked like part of a shirt. A few yards away, there was what looked like a rusted chain partially emerging from the dark water. That was when I heard a sound coming from the forest behind me. Fast footsteps over dry leaves. More than one person. I turned around immediately and saw movement between the trees. I couldn't make out faces clearly because everything happened too fast, but there were at least 2 men coming toward me through the woods. Neither of them was fully running, but they were moving quickly enough to make it obvious they were heading straight for me. One of them shouted something I couldn't understand because of the wind. I didn't think. I just ran back to the car. I slipped in the mud and nearly fell beside the door, while behind me I could hear footsteps speeding up too. I jumped into the car, slammed the door, and took off so fast the wheels spun in the mud before gaining traction. Through the rearview mirror, I could still see one of the men reaching the dock. He didn't try to follow me with another vehicle. He just stood there watching while I drove away along the narrow road between the trees. The worst part was that a few seconds before the lake disappeared from view, I saw something else near the shore. Something large, partially submerged in the dark water, trapped near the reeds. It looked metallic. Maybe part of an old sunken car. Maybe not. I never returned to Birch Creek after that day. My grandmother's house was sold a few months later through a realtor, so I never had to go back. I also never showed those Polaroids to anyone besides a friend of mine in Minneapolis. And honestly, now I understand why people in that town avoided talking about Blackwater Lake. I don't think there's anything supernatural there. I think the truth is worse precisely because it's human, because somebody knew exactly what was in that lake all those years, and because apparently some people still make sure nobody gets too curious about it. Story 2. I had just come out of a complicated divorce when I accepted that job in Nebraska. At the time, I was 29 years old and worked temporary administrative jobs for small hospitals and rural clinics. It was the kind of work that came up quickly, paid reasonably well, and usually included some kind of housing assistance. I had been living in Kansas City before that, but honestly, I needed to get away from there for a while. Everything in that city reminded me of my ex-husband. So when a 3-month position opened at a clinic in the town of Belmere, Nebraska, I accepted without thinking too much about it. Belmere was tiny, one of those towns where practically everyone seems to know each other and downtown closes way too early. I arrived on a Tuesday in early November after driving about 6 hours through light rain and gray skies. The whole town felt frozen in time. Old gas stations, rusted signs, leafless trees, and barely anyone on the streets. The real estate office that rented houses to clinic employees was in a small building near the main avenue. The woman who handed me the keys looked to be in her 50s, with short blonde hair and a strange habit of speaking quietly all the time. Her name was Patricia. She seemed eager to end the conversation from the beginning. She quickly explained where the grocery store, pharmacy, and gas station were, then added something I initially thought was just small-town eccentricity. She said, "If possible, avoid bothering the neighbors after 9 at night." She said it with a slight smile, like it was a completely normal recommendation. I even joked, asking if people there just went to bed really early. She didn't laugh. She only replied, "People value privacy on that street." Then she handed me the key and left before I even finished unloading my car. The house was on an old street near the oldest part of town. It was a small, dark wooden house with a narrow porch and a tiny backyard. Nothing scary at first glance, just old. The entire street looked like that. Old houses packed closely together, short lamp posts and huge trees spread along cracked sidewalks. By the time I arrived, it was already starting to get dark, that cold late afternoon typical of rural towns in November. And it was while unloading my luggage that I noticed the first strange thing. Every house on the street had the curtains completely closed. Not partially closed, completely shut. Every single window. Some even had blinds behind them. I remember thinking it was odd because it was only around 5 in the afternoon and there was still enough daylight outside. Even so, not one window was open, no visible television screens, no silhouettes moving around, nothing. The place felt empty while somehow also giving me the feeling of being watched. While I carried boxes from the car, I noticed slight movements behind the curtains of 2 different houses, like someone discreetly peeking through the fabric. But every time I turned directly toward the movement, it stopped immediately. That first night, I tried to ignore the feeling. I unpacked a few things, ordered food from a restaurant in town, and sat on the couch watching something random on my laptop. The house made constant noises because of the wind, popping sounds in the walls, creaking wood, pipes vibrating. Nothing unusual for an old house, just uncomfortable. Around 9 at night, while washing a glass in the kitchen, I clearly heard a door slam outside. Then another, like several people on the street were leaving their houses at the same time. I thought it was strange because until then, the street had seemed completely dead. I walked to the living room window and pulled back one corner of the curtain just enough to look outside. And I realized the entire street was still dark and silent. No people visible, no passing cars. Just those closed houses and motionless curtains covering every window. The next morning I woke up early to start at the clinic. I had slept badly because of the cold and the noises in the house. The heating worked inconsistently, so some parts of the house were too warm while others felt freezing. When I opened the living room curtain to let light in, I immediately noticed something else strange. Every house on the street looked exactly the same as the night before. Curtains closed, no windows open, not even a crack, and it was already almost 8 in the morning. A light fog covered part of the street and everything felt damp and far too quiet. During breakfast, I kept watching through the window, waiting to see some resident leave for work or do anything remotely normal. Nothing. Around 8:30, I finally saw a woman quickly crossing the sidewalk on the opposite side carrying grocery bags. She entered her house without looking around and shut the door so quickly it almost looked nervous. At the clinic, I casually tried mentioning the street to a receptionist named Megan. I asked if that neighborhood was older or mostly full of elderly residents because nobody ever seemed to leave their homes. She became uncomfortable instantly. She didn't answer directly. She only asked what street I was living on. When I told her the name, she lowered her eyes for a second and changed the subject almost immediately. That genuinely started bothering me because it was the second time in less than 24 hours someone reacted that way. Later during lunch, I overheard 2 nurses quietly talking about the Curtain Street. They stopped speaking the second they realized I was nearby. One of them even gave me a strange look before leaving the room. At that point, I was still trying to convince myself it was probably some ridiculous local superstition or simply extremely private residence. But the more people avoided the subject, the worse the feeling became. The second night was when things started happening that truly made me want to leave. I was lying on the living room couch watching a show on my laptop because I still hadn't fully set up the bedroom. The house was completely silent except for the wind outside. Around 11 at night, I heard doors opening on the street again. This time it wasn't 2 or 3, it was several, one after another. The sound echoed clearly through the empty block. I closed the laptop and listened. Then I heard footsteps, lots of footsteps, slow, rhythmic, like multiple people walking together along the sidewalk. My first thought was maybe some church group or community gathering had ended, but that didn't make sense at that hour. Curiosity overcame discomfort, and I walked to the front window. I pulled the curtain back only a few centimeters so I could look outside without being seen, and I immediately felt my stomach drop. People were coming out of practically every house on the street at the same time. Men, women, and some elderly people, all walking slowly in complete silence along the sidewalk. Nobody talked. Nobody looked at a phone. Nobody even seemed to acknowledge each other. They simply walked in the same direction toward the last house on the block, a larger, darker building partially hidden behind huge trees. The scene felt wrong precisely because it was too quiet. I could hear nothing except shoes scraping against dry leaves and the wind moving through the branches. Some residents wore long, dark coats. Others looked like they had come straight out of bed in pajamas. Then one woman in the middle of the group stopped walking. Very slowly, she turned her head directly toward my house, and at the exact same moment, the other people began stopping too. I remember exactly how that felt because it was one of the most uncomfortable experiences of my life. It didn't feel like those people had simply noticed movement at the window. It felt like they already knew I was watching. One by one, they slowly turned toward my house. Some were standing in the middle of the street, others on the sidewalk, completely motionless. I couldn't clearly make out their faces because of the distance and weak streetlights, but I could unmistakably tell they were staring directly at my window. My heart started pounding so hard I felt that awful pressure in my chest and hands. The most logical reaction would have been to close the curtain and walk away, but I stayed frozen watching them. Maybe because my brain was still desperately trying to find a rational explanation. After a few seconds that felt much longer, one of the people, a tall man wearing a dark cap, discreetly pointed toward my house. Nobody said a word, not a sound. Then they all continued walking as if nothing had happened. Slowly, they reached the final house on the street and started entering through a side door lit by a weak yellow light. One by one, in complete silence. The last person to enter was the woman who first noticed me. Before disappearing through the doorway, she looked directly at my window one more time. I closed the curtain immediately after that and stood in the dark living room, trying to control my breathing. I spent the rest of the night barely sleeping, occasionally hearing distant sounds coming from the end of the street. Not music, not normal conversation, just voices too quiet to distinguish any words. The next morning I woke up determined to find another house or even a hotel. The feeling inside that neighborhood had completely changed after the previous night. While getting ready to leave, I watched the street through the kitchen window. Everything looked normal again. Closed houses, closed curtains, no movement. But this time there was one difference. Some people were clearly watching me from behind the curtains. I could see tiny gaps opening and closing whenever I passed near the windows. At the clinic, I tried directly asking Megan what was happening on that street. She instantly went pale, literally pale. She only said I should keep my curtains closed at night and avoid drawing attention. When I asked what that meant, she answered something even worse. They don't like curious people. Before I could press further, she left the room claiming she needed to help a patient. At that point, I was seriously considering leaving the entire town. But the strangest thing happened at the end of my shift. When I walked to my car, I found an envelope tucked beneath the windshield wiper. There was no name on it. Inside was only a folded piece of paper with a short sentence typed in capital letters. Keep the curtains closed tonight. No signature, No explanation. And in the bottom corner of the paper, there was a small dark stain like someone had handled it with wet fingers. I sat in my car staring at that note for several minutes without knowing what to do. Part of me wanted to laugh and assume it was some stupid small-town prank. But honestly, after what I saw the night before, it didn't feel like a joke at all. The dark stain on the paper bothered me more than it should have. It didn't look like ink. It looked like damp dirt or rust. During the drive back home, I started noticing how strange Belmere felt in the late afternoon. The streets emptied too early. People avoided eye contact. Some businesses closed before 6. When I turned onto my street, I felt that awful tightness in my stomach again. Every house remained shut and motionless, as if nobody actually lived there during the day. I hurried inside, locked the door, and for the first time seriously considered calling the police. But something told me that probably wouldn't help. Maybe because nobody in town acted like any of this was unusual. While making something quick to eat, I noticed another strange detail. There were damp marks on the outside of some of the windows, as if someone had pressed their hands against the glass during the previous night. I walked closer to the kitchen window and could clearly distinguish the partial shape of fingers in the dried condensation near the lower corner. My entire body broke into chills instantly. I closed every curtain in the house before it even got fully dark. I turned the television volume up loud just to fill the strange silence of that place. But around 9 at night, I started hearing movement outside again. First doors opening, then slow footsteps. Lots of footsteps. This time closer than the night before. I sat on the couch pretending to ignore it, but the sounds wouldn't stop. It felt like people were walking back and forth directly in front of my house. At one point, I clearly heard someone stop on my porch. I stayed completely still listening. The wooden porch creaked slowly beneath the weight of someone walking very carefully near the front door. Then silence. No knocking this time. Just presence. I could feel my heart racing uncontrollably while trying to hear anything beyond the wind. Then I heard a low sound coming from the side of the house, like fingernails or fingertips slowly dragging across the wooden wall. The noise continued for several seconds, scraping, stopping, then continuing again. I grabbed my phone and considered filming through the window, but honestly, I was too afraid to put my face near the curtains. A few minutes later, I heard very quiet voices outside. I couldn't make out any words. They sounded like short whispers exchanged among several people. The feeling was horrible because it seemed like there were people surrounding the entire house without making almost any noise. At some point, maybe around midnight, the sounds suddenly stopped. Complete silence again. I thought it was over, so I made the worst possible decision, looking through the upstairs bedroom window. I went upstairs slowly, trying not to make noise, and pulled back the tiniest corner of the curtain. The instant I looked outside, my entire body turned cold. People were standing motionless all across the street, staring at my house. They weren't walking this time, just standing there, some alone on the sidewalk, others grouped near the trees, every single one of them staring at the dark windows of the house. And at the end of the block outside that larger house, I could see dozens of people gathered near the illuminated side entrance. Then one woman slowly stepped away from the group and started walking toward my house. And as she moved down the street, the other people slowly turned their heads to follow her movement without taking their eyes off my window. I backed away from the window so fast I slammed my hip against the bedroom dresser. My first instinct was grabbing my car keys and leaving immediately, even though it was the middle of the night. The feeling inside that house had gone far beyond ordinary discomfort. It felt like I had accidentally witnessed something I was never supposed to see. While throwing clothes into my suitcase, I heard the porch floor creak downstairs again. Then another sound. A soft knock at the front door. Just one. A few seconds later came another. Slow. Deliberate. It wasn't someone trying to get inside. It was worse. It felt like someone wanted me to know they were still there. I grabbed my suitcase, rushed downstairs barely breathing, and headed into the kitchen to grab my keys. Then I heard something at the back door too. A sharp knock. That was when I realized there were people on both sides of the house. The streetlights partially shined through the gaps in the curtains and I could see shadows moving outside. Lots of shadows. My whole body started shaking for real then. Not controlled fear, actual trembling in my hands and legs. I ran to the side garage without turning on any lights and got into the car as quickly as possible. The second the engine started, I heard immediate movement outside the house. Fast footsteps on the porch. When the headlights partially illuminated the street, I saw several people standing there staring directly toward the open garage. None of them ran. None of them shouted. They only watched. The woman who had stepped away from the group at the end of the street was now standing almost directly in front of my yard. She looked around 60 years old, with gray hair pulled back and a completely empty expression. The moment I started backing out of the driveway, she slowly raised one hand and pointed toward my upstairs window. I left Belmere that same night. I never even stopped at the clinic. I never returned to collect the rest of my belongings. I drove almost 3 straight hours until I reached a larger town where I found a hotel near the highway. I only managed to sleep after sunrise. The next day, I called the clinic, made up a family emergency, and told them I wouldn't be returning. They accepted it with almost no questions asked. The strangest part happened a few days later after I was back in Kansas City. I received a phone call from the Belmere real estate office. It was Patricia. Her voice sounded nervous. She asked if I had told anyone about the street. She didn't explain anything else. She just repeated that question twice. When I asked what exactly was happening there, she stayed silent for a few seconds before replying. Some communities prefer to keep the old traditions. Then she hung up. I tried researching Belmere online months later, but there's almost no information about that specific street. No strange news stories, no records, nothing. But one thing has never left my mind since then. That final night while backing out of the garage, I briefly saw inside the house at the end of the block when the side door opened. There were far more people inside than should have been possible, all motionless, all staring toward the street, and behind them, on the living room wall, there were dozens of old photographs hanging together. Photographs of the houses on that street taken over many years, including the house I rented. And in some of them, you could see people watching from the upstairs windows exactly the way I had been doing that night. Story 3. I was hired as a clerk at the Cold Creek Sheriff's Office in Montana in early March of 2021. I was 31 years old at the time and had just left Billings after losing my previous job at a small law office during the pandemic. Cold Creek was a tiny town in the middle of the state, the kind surrounded by highways, pastures, and low mountains in the distance. The population was probably around 3,000 people, maybe less. Honestly, I accepted the job because I needed something stable quickly. The salary wasn't great, but it included a simple apartment near the sheriff's office and seemed like a decent fresh start after a pretty bad period in my life. The sheriff's office operated out of an old dark brick building downtown, next to the post office and a 24-hour diner. The place had that constant smell of old coffee, damp paper, and overheated radiators. Almost everyone there seemed to know who I was before I even arrived, which always happens in small towns. The officers were polite but reserved. The sheriff, a man named Dalton Reeves, treated me well from the first day, although he had that exhausted look of someone who had worked in the same place far too long. My job was basically paperwork. Filing reports, organizing old documents, digitizing records, and helping at the front desk when necessary. Nothing too complicated. During the first week, I started noticing how the sheriff's office seemed frozen in time. There were rusty metal cabinets, folders piled up for decades, and entire rooms that practically nobody used anymore. One particularly slow afternoon, Dalton casually mentioned there was an old storage room in the basement full of boxes that had never really been cataloged properly. He joked that maybe I could work a miracle on that mess. At the time, I thought it sounded great. It seemed like an easy way to prove myself. The records room was located in the basement behind a heavy gray door near the old unused jail cells. The place clearly hadn't been opened in a long time. When I unlocked the door for the first time, I immediately noticed the strong smell of dust, mildew, and aging paper. The fluorescent lights took several seconds to turn on, flickering before partially illuminating the room. It was larger than I expected. Metal shelves stretched all the way to the ceiling, boxes were stacked across the floor, and files were scattered everywhere without any organization. Some folders were literally falling apart. I spent the first 2 days just separating documents by decade and throwing away useless forms. Most of it was normal stuff. Old traffic tickets, domestic disturbance reports, traffic accidents, illegal hunting complaints. But on the third day I found something strange. Inside an unmarked box there were dozens of missing person reports connected to the same road. Hollow Creek Road. I had never heard of it before. The documents ranged from the 1960s all the way to the early 2000s. Men, women, truck drivers, travelers, and even local residents disappearing near that rural road outside Cold Creek. The strange detail wasn't just the number of cases. It was how they all ended almost exactly the same way. Investigation closed. Person considered voluntarily missing. Insufficient evidence. Some files were less than 2 pages long. Others included complete statements from family members insisting the victims would never simply leave without warning. And the names started repeating in an uncomfortable way. The same surnames appeared decades apart. In one statement, a woman claimed her brother disappeared on the exact same stretch of road where her father vanished back in the 1970s. That bothered me more than it should have because it didn't feel like a normal small-town coincidence. It felt like a pattern someone had deliberately ignored for a very long time. Over the next few days, I started spending more time in that basement room than in my own office. Part of it was curiosity, but honestly, the place also felt isolated from the rest of the sheriff's office. Things upstairs were usually quiet, so almost nobody noticed how long I spent organizing files. I continued sorting through the cases connected to Hollow Creek Road and quickly noticed other strange similarities. Many disappearances happened around the same time of night, usually between late evening and early morning. Some reports mentioned abandoned vehicles found on the roadside with the doors open and personal belongings still inside. Others didn't even have that. In several cases, local residents claimed they had seen lights parked near the road late at night, or unidentified vehicles driving around the area. The most unsettling part was realizing how superficial the investigation seemed. Some cases were closed after only a few days with almost no searches officially recorded. In one 1987 report, an officer simply wrote, "Area too large for continued investigation." That was it. A missing man, and the investigation ended with a sentence like that. I started writing some names down separately to see if there were connections between the families. That was when I found a surname I immediately recognized. Reeves. The same last name as Sheriff Dalton. In a file from 1974, there was a report about a man named Thomas Reeves disappearing near Hollow Creek Road. The report stated he was the cousin of a local deputy. It explained nothing else. The case was closed in less than a week. Reading that gave me the unpleasant feeling that I was digging into something I probably shouldn't touch. Even so, I kept going. That afternoon, I also found an old photograph attached to one of the reports. It showed a stretch of the road at night illuminated only by the headlights of a patrol car. And in the background, partially hidden among leafless trees, there was a small wooden structure that wasn't mentioned anywhere else in the documents. That Thursday, I finally decided to mention Hollow Creek Road to someone at the sheriff's office. I didn't make a big deal about it or anything. I was in the break room getting coffee when an older deputy named Ray Monroe walked in. Ray had to be close to 60, with a sunburned face and that quiet personality typical of people who worked in rural towns for decades. I casually mentioned I had been organizing old records and asked if he knew the road. The change in his behavior was immediate. I still remember it clearly. The man literally stopped stirring his coffee halfway through the motion and stared at me for several seconds without answering. The break room was silent except for the sound of the coffee machine and the heater in the hallway. When he finally responded, his voice came out far too low. He asked exactly where I found those files. I explained about the box in the basement. Ray then asked which cases I had read. It didn't sound like ordinary curiosity. It sounded like concern. As I started mentioning a few names, he became visibly more uneasy. He kept rubbing his face, glancing toward the break room door constantly, and avoiding direct eye contact. Then he said something that immediately unsettled me. "You need to stop digging through those boxes." I awkwardly laughed and asked why. I thought maybe they were sensitive cases involving local families, but Ray didn't really explain. He only said those files were old, many of the officers involved were already dead, and that some things were left behind for a reason. The way he said it sounded more like a warning than advice. Before leaving the room, he placed a hand on my shoulder and said a sentence that echoed in my mind for the rest of the day. "If you find anything connected to Hollow Creek, close the folder and forget it." Then he walked out without even finishing his coffee. After that conversation, I started noticing small changes inside the sheriff's office. Maybe I was already becoming paranoid at that point, but it felt like some people were watching me more than before. Whenever I walked through the hallways carrying old boxes or folders, certain conversations stopped immediately. On 2 separate occasions, I returned from lunch and found my office slightly disturbed. Nothing stolen. Just objects moved out of place. Drawers left partially open and files shifted around on my desk. I tried ignoring it because I didn't want to seem crazy during my first month on the job, but the uncomfortable feeling only got worse. That same afternoon, I returned to the basement, determined to finish cataloging the Hollow Creek Road files before someone decided to remove them. The more I read, the stranger everything became. There were reports of entire families insisting the victims had been afraid of that road before disappearing. Some mentioned pickup trucks parked along the shoulder without license plates. Others talked about an abandoned structure near the woods where people heard engines running late at night. In one statement from 1996, a truck driver claimed he saw men carrying something heavy into the forest near the road around 3 in the morning. The statement ended with a handwritten note from some deputy. Witness emotionally unstable, unreliable. Except the man disappeared 2 weeks later according to another report attached behind it. And his case was also closed without any serious investigation. At that moment, I started feeling actual physical danger. Not curiosity anymore. Danger. It felt like I was reading something that never should have remained stored inside that building. While organizing folders, I heard footsteps in the basement hallway and quickly shut one of the boxes, thinking someone was about to walk in. But nobody appeared. The hallway became silent again. Even so, I had the clear feeling that someone was standing just outside the door listening. That night, I stayed late at the sheriff's office because I wanted to finish digitizing some records before the end of the shift. Around 10:30, almost everyone had gone home. Only 2 deputies on patrol and Dalton in his office remained. The whole building felt different at that hour, quieter, darker. The heating system made constant metallic noises and the hallway lights flickered slightly every now and then. I came upstairs from the basement carrying a small box with some files I intended to review back at the apartment. As I passed Dalton's office, I saw him standing completely motionless, staring out the front window of the sheriff's office. He looked tense. The moment he noticed me, he asked what I was carrying. I replied that they were some old files I wanted to catalog more carefully. His eyes immediately dropped to the label on the box where it said, Hollow Creek RD. There was a strange silence for several seconds. Then Dalton's entire tone changed. It became cold. He said those documents were not supposed to leave the sheriff's office. I asked why, and he answered too quickly that they were official records not yet digitized. It didn't sound true. As I returned the box to my desk, I noticed he kept staring at me without blinking much at all. Before walking back into his office, he quietly said something I almost didn't hear. Some roads around here are better left forgotten. That unsettled me enough that I decided to leave soon after. But when I went back downstairs to return the files to the basement, I found the records room door open. I knew for a fact I had locked it, and the moment I stepped inside, my stomach dropped. Every box connected to Hollow Creek Road was gone. The room was completely torn apart. Empty shelves, dust scattered across the floor, and fresh drag marks leading toward the door where boxes had clearly been moved quickly. Some ripped folders were scattered near the wall, but specifically the Hollow Creek files had disappeared entirely. My first thought was that Dalton had ordered someone to remove everything after our conversation upstairs, but one thing didn't make sense. The padlock was broken on the floor, literally broken, like someone had forced it open with tools. I stood there trying to process it while the buzzing fluorescent lights sounded louder than ever in the silence. The basement air was far too warm because of the old heating system, but I still felt cold. I started looking around to see whether anything else had been taken. That was when I noticed a single folder lying behind a partially bent metal shelf. Maybe it had been overlooked in the rush. I quickly picked it up and saw it was a missing person report from 1982. The victim was a woman named Evelyn Harper. The strange detail was that several pages had been manually torn out. Only the initial report and a photograph attached with a rusted paperclip remained. The photograph showed a stretch of Hollow Creek Road during winter covered in snow. And in the background, almost hidden among the trees, there was that same small wooden structure I had already seen in another old photo. On the back of the picture there was a handwritten note. "They use the barn." Before I could think too much about it, I heard fast footsteps coming down the basement hallway. Not normal footsteps, heavy, hurried footsteps. I immediately shoved the folder into my backpack and turned toward the door, just as Ray Monroe appeared. Ray looked genuinely nervous, breathing hard, face red, constantly glancing back into the hallway like he was afraid someone might overhear us. The moment he entered the room, he asked if anyone else had seen the file I was holding. I lied and said no. He shut the door behind him and quietly told me to listen carefully. He said I needed to leave Cold Creek immediately and forget everything connected to Hollow Creek Road. I asked what was actually out there, but Ray took several seconds before answering. Then he said something that made me feel even worse. It wasn't just disappearances. According to him, for years people found near that area either turned up dead or were never found at all because certain incidents were never officially recorded. He also said some older deputies were involved in arrangements with men who had been using isolated areas near the road for illegal activities for decades. When I asked what kind of activities, Ray simply shook his head and replied that the less I knew, the better. The most terrifying part was the way he seemed genuinely frightened while talking. He didn't sound like a man inventing conspiracy theories. He sounded like someone carrying guilt for many years. Before leaving, he pointed at my backpack and told me to destroy any copies or notes connected to the files. Then he said one final sentence I never forgot. "If they realized you started putting the pieces together, they won't let you keep looking." That same night, when I finally left the sheriff's office close to midnight, I found my pickup truck parked alone behind the building. And tucked beneath the windshield wiper was a piece of paper with only 3 handwritten words: "Stop digging." The moment I saw that note, I felt a much more real fear than anything that had happened before. Because until then, I could still convince myself maybe I was slipping into paranoia fueled by old files and strange small-town behavior. But that was direct. Someone knew exactly what I was investigating. And someone had walked up to my truck while I was still inside the sheriff's office. I stood there looking around the empty parking lot, trying to spot any movement. But there was only the strong wind blowing across the street and the distant sound of a train moving through town. I quickly got into the truck, locked the doors, and sat there for several seconds trying to think clearly before driving away. The heater took forever to warm up, and my hands were shaking so badly I nearly dropped the keys. During the drive back to my apartment, I started noticing headlights behind me on the main road. A dark pickup truck maintaining a constant distance. At first I assumed it was coincidence, but even after turning down 2 smaller streets, it stayed behind me. It didn't speed up. It didn't try to pass me. It simply followed. The worst part was that Cold Creek was practically deserted at that hour. No other cars. No pedestrians. Just that truck trailing me through the empty streets. When I pulled into my apartment parking lot, it finally drove straight past without slowing down. I couldn't make out the license plate or the driver's face because of the darkness. I spent the entire night awake with the folder hidden inside my backpack beside the bed. Sometime around 3 in the morning, I heard a vehicle stop briefly in front of the building. I watched through the crack in the curtain until the headlights disappeared. By then, I had already decided I was leaving Cold Creek the next day. I just wanted to survive until morning. The next morning, I woke up early and went straight to the sheriff's office, determined to resign and collect the rest of my belongings. The building felt strangely quiet when I arrived. Dalton wasn't there. Ray wasn't either. Only a temporary receptionist organizing paperwork near the entrance. While emptying my desk, I overheard 2 deputies quietly discussing a fire during the night near Hollow Creek Road. My entire body went cold instantly. I tried listening more carefully, but they stopped talking the moment they noticed me nearby. Before leaving, I walked down to the basement one more time. The records room door was closed with a brand new padlock, as if nothing had happened. When I casually asked the receptionist whether someone had reorganized the storage room overnight, she replied that the room had been closed for maintenance for weeks. She didn't even look at me while saying it. That confirmed everything for me. I left the sheriff's office, loaded my bags into the truck, and drove out of Cold Creek without really telling anyone goodbye. Several hours later, already on the highway back toward Billings, I stopped at an isolated gas station to refuel. That was when I finally reopened the folder hidden in my backpack. Inside, besides the torn report and the old photograph, there was something else I hadn't noticed before tucked between the pages. A folded map of the Hollow Creek area with one location circled in red near the forest. Beside the circle were only 2 handwritten words: Old Barn. I never returned to Montana after that. I also never handed that file over to anyone because honestly I don't know who I can trust. But I still think about it sometimes, especially because a few months later I tried researching news about the fire near Hollow Creek Road. The only thing I found was a short article in a local newspaper saying an abandoned structure had burned completely during the night. No victims found. No investigation opened. And when I saw the photograph attached to the article, I recognized the destroyed building immediately. It was the same barn appearing in the background of the photographs from the missing files inside the sheriff's office.
Thank you very much for your company until the end. Your support is what gives life to this channel. If these stories have caught you, don't forget to leave your like and comment on your opinion. And if you are not yet part of our community, sign up now to receive the next real horror stories.